They said a governess who fell for a duke could only end one way: ruined, disgraced, cast out with nothing but shame. Elizabeth Grey knew the rules. A woman of her class didn't touch men like Alexander Blackwood. But when she arrived at that cursed manor, where a duchess had died screaming, where a child hadn't spoken in 2 years, where servants whispered about ghosts in the West Wing, everything she thought she knew about survival shattered. What began as desperate employment became something far more dangerous, a forbidden attraction that could destroy them both. Society doesn't forgive women who forget their place. And Alexander? He'd already buried one love. What made Elizabeth think she'd be different? Yet in 70 days, everything would change in ways no one could predict. Elizabeth Grey couldn't breathe. The letter in her trembling hands was a death sentence. 24 hours to vacate the rented room. 24 hours before her mother and younger sister would be on the streets. 3 shillings lay on the table. That was all she had left. How did it come to this, she thought, clenching her fists so tightly her nails bit into her palms. How does a woman from a good family who can play the pianoforte and speak French fall so far? But she knew how. It had started 3 days ago at Lady Ashford's residence. The memory burned like acid. Lady Ashford's shrill voice still echoed, "You dare correct my daughter's French pronunciation? You, a penniless nobody living on charity?" 15 aristocratic ladies had stared. Some smirked. Others looked away. "Pack your things. You're dismissed. No references, no final wages." Now, in the cramped room smelling of damp and old wood, Elizabeth felt the weight of every decision. Father's gambling debts, his death 5 years ago, mother's illness, Caroline's education she'd sworn to continue. She looked at her reflection. 23 years old, eyes holding exhaustion of someone twice her age. Dark circles beneath green eyes, hair pulled back so severely it made her temples ache. "I won't cry," she whispered. "Crying won't feed them." A knock shattered the silence. Her heart lurched. But when she opened the door, a man in immaculate livery stood there. Silver buttons gleamed. "Miss Elizabeth Grey?" "Yes?" "His Grace the Duke of Blackwood requests your presence, immediately." The world tilted. The Duke of Blackwood, the most feared man in London. They said he hadn't smiled since his wife died 3 years ago. They said servants left his employ within months, unable to bear his coldness. They said his estate was cursed. There must be some mistake. "No mistake, miss. The carriage is waiting." What choice did she have? In 24 hours, her family would be homeless. "I'll get my cloak." But what Elizabeth didn't know, as that carriage carried her toward an isolated manor, her life was about to change in ways no one could predict. A grieving duke, a silent child, a house full of secrets, and a love that would break every rule society held sacred. Stay with me, because what happens when a penniless governess falls for a man sworn never to love again will change everything. The carriage was luxurious, velvet seats, brass fittings gleaming. Elizabeth sat stiffly, trying not to touch anything with her worn dress. Silence inside was suffocating. What could he want, she thought frantically. The Duke doesn't know my name. Unless Lady Ashford complained? Is this some final humiliation? 20 minutes later, they reached Mayfair. Wide streets, smooth cobblestones, residences like white fortresses. The carriage stopped before an imposing townhouse with columns. Inside took her breath. Marble floors gleamed under a crystal chandelier. Red-carpeted stairs led upward. Everything screamed wealth but was cold. No flowers, no family portraits, no life. "Miss Grey," a deep voice said. She spun. In the study doorway stood a man, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed entirely in black, about 35, dark hair silvered at temples. But his eyes, steel gray, cold as mountain ice. The Duke of Blackwood. "Your Grace," she whispered, curtsying. Her legs trembled. "Please enter. A command, not invitation." The study was masculine, Spartan. Bookshelves covered walls. A heavy oak desk dominated. Tobacco and leather scented the air. He sat, not inviting her to sit. "I need a governess for my niece," he said without preamble, emotionless. "The child is 6. She hasn't spoken in 2 years. 4 previous governesses resigned within a week." Elizabeth blinked. "Hasn't spoken? Is it illness?" "That's not your concern," his tone warned. "Don't ask." Silence thickened. She thought, this is a trap. Why would a duke turn to someone like me? Reading her mind, he added, "I heard about your dismissal. Your situation is desperate. So is my offer. Blackwood Manor is 50 miles from London, God-forsaken. You'll be isolated. No society, no balls, no company. And the salary? £50 annually. Room and board plus £10 advance today. Her heart nearly stopped. £10, rent for 3 months, food, medicine for mother. But his eyes terrified her, empty, looking through her, not at her. Why me? Something crossed his face. Exhaustion? Pain? Because you have nothing to lose. That makes you the only person who might accept life at Blackwood Manor. His hand on the desk was clenched. A scar ran from wrist to knuckles. I must think. No. Sharp. Decide now, yes or no. In 1 hour my carriage leaves. Either you're in it or not. Elizabeth looked into those cold eyes and realized. This man was as trapped as she was. She saw it in his clenched jaw. In trembling fingers he quickly hid. I accept, she said before reason protested. Something flashed in his eyes. Relief? Gone too quickly to tell. Excellent. The carriage departs at 5. Don't be late. He stood, ending the conversation. But as she passed, his voice stopped her. Miss Gray, at Blackwood Manor there are rules. Don't enter the West Wing. Don't ask about the first Duchess, and don't try to fix what is irreparably broken. As the carriage took her back through London, Elizabeth held the envelope with £10. Real weight, but the Duke's words echoed. Irreparably broken. What awaited at Blackwood Manor? And why did she feel she'd just agreed to something far more dangerous than employment? The journey to Blackwood Manor took 5 hours. With each passing mile, London vanished and the world grew wilder. Trees grew denser, the road narrowed, the sky darkened, though it was only 6 in the evening. Elizabeth pressed her face to the cold carriage window. God-forsaken place. The Duke's words proved prophetic. They hadn't passed a village in an hour. Only forest, marshland, and crows circling above fields. Suddenly the carriage turned and she saw it. Blackwood Manor. The residence rose like a dark giant against gray sky. 3 stories of black stone, dozens of windows, most with shutters closed. 2 guard towers flanked the sides, giving it the appearance of a prison, not a home. Ivy wrapped the walls so thickly it looked as if the forest was trying to swallow the building whole. Here I'm to live, she thought, cold settling in her stomach. This looks like a place where hope goes to die. The carriage stopped before massive oak doors. The footman opened the door but didn't meet her eyes. Strange. Servants usually stared at new guests with curiosity. Heavy doors opened with a creak. An elderly man stood in the doorway, butler with gray sideburns and sad eyes. Miss Gray, welcome to Blackwood Manor. I'm Harrison. His voice was kind, but tension hung in the air. She noticed his gaze dart down the corridor, as if checking whether someone observed them. The entrance hall was enormous and dark. A crystal chandelier was covered in dust, clearly not lit in years. Black marble stairs led upward, splitting into 2 arms. On the left hung a portrait of a woman in a white dress. She had fair hair and a gentle smile. But someone had slashed the painting diagonally, a wound running through her heart. The first Duchess? She whispered, unable to stop herself. Harrison blinked quickly. Please follow me, Miss Gray. The young lady is waiting. He avoided answering. Don't ask questions about the first Duchess. The Duke's warning echoed. He led her down a long corridor. Dark wallpaper with dead birds as motifs covered the walls. Every footstep echoed. She noticed something else. All doors on the left side were closed, not just closed, bolted. The West Wing, Harrison murmured, seeing her look. Forbidden. Harrison was so old he sometimes confused names. As they climbed the stairs, he called her Miss Eleanor twice. She didn't correct him. Arguing with a man who'd probably served 3 dukes seemed pointless. Besides, there was something endearing about his gentle confusion. The nursery was on the 2nd floor. Harrison knocked gently. Miss Amelia, your new governess has arrived. Silence. He opened the door. The room was surprisingly bright, the only place in this house that seemed alive. Pink curtains, shelves full of dolls, a pianoforte in the corner. But by the window turned away sat a small girl. She had dark curls tied with a white ribbon, a dress blue as summer sky. She looked like a porcelain doll. She didn't move when they entered. Amelia, Elizabeth said gently, kneeling beside the chair. My name is Elizabeth. I'll be your new... The child finally turned. She had huge brown eyes, the Duke's eyes, but in them was an emptiness that broke hearts. She looked at Elizabeth for a long moment, then turned back to the window. She doesn't speak, Harrison reminded quietly. For 2 years. Since the day when since that day. Has a doctor? 4 of the best from London. All said the same. Physically, she's healthy. It's her mind. Something inside shut down. Elizabeth studied the little girl. Amelia was 6, but her eyes were ancient. She knew what it meant to be silent when the world was too painful for words. She herself sometimes dreamed of stopping talking, stopping pretending everything was fine. May I be alone with her? Harrison hesitated, then nodded. Dinner at 8. His Grace. He paused. His Grace dines in his study, alone. When the door closed, Elizabeth approached the pianoforte. Dust covered the keys. No one had played it in ages. She touched one key. The sound was pure, the instrument well-tuned. She sat and began to play. Not a grand sonata, not a showy piece. A simple lullaby her mother sang when she was small. Her fingers moved across the keys, and the melody filled the room with warmth. After a minute, she heard rustling. Without turning, she knew. Amelia stood right behind her. She felt her presence. She continued playing, letting the music speak what words couldn't. When she finished, small fingers touched her shoulder, very gently, like a butterfly's touch. Elizabeth turned slowly. Amelia stood inches away. Tears flowed down her cheeks, but she made no sound. I know, Elizabeth whispered. I sometimes want to cry in silence, too. The child didn't respond with words, but she laid her small head on Elizabeth's lap. And for the first time in weeks, Elizabeth felt she could do something good, that maybe she wasn't here just to survive. Maybe she was here to save someone. But when she looked through the window, in the distance, in the darkened west wing, she noticed a single light. Someone was there, watching. And as the candle flickered in that forbidden wing, Elizabeth felt something she couldn't name. Not fear exactly, something deeper, as if the house itself was alive, waiting, watching. A shiver ran down her spine. The first 3 days at Blackwood Manor taught Elizabeth 2 things. First, this place lived by its own strange rules. Servants moved like ghosts, whispering. Meals served at precisely the same hours. Doors to the west wing remained locked. Second, the Duke of Blackwood avoided her like plague. She saw him only once, striding through a corridor at dawn. His cloak billowed behind him, steps swift, determined. He didn't glance her direction, but she noticed his face was even paler than during their first meeting. Shadows under his eyes deeper, as if sleep was a stranger. What torments him, she wondered, watching through the window as he disappeared into the stables. A man who has everything, title, fortune, power, yet looks like a prisoner in his own home. Amelia was also a puzzle. The child sat for hours by the window, staring at the forest. She ate mechanically when food was offered, dressed without protest, but her eyes remained empty, as if the real Amelia hid somewhere deep inside, unreachable. On the 4th morning, Elizabeth decided to try something new. Instead of reading or arithmetic lessons, she opened the pianoforte and played again. This time, not a lullaby, but a cheerful polka she'd learned as a child. The melody bounced off walls, filling the room with energy that felt almost rebellious in this somber house. Amelia didn't move from her chair, but her foot, very slightly, tapped in rhythm. Elizabeth's heart leaped. Progress, she thought feverishly. Small, but still progress. She played another piece, then another. For an hour the room filled with music, and slowly, degree by degree, Amelia turned her head. First, only inches, then more, until finally she stared directly at Elizabeth, those huge brown eyes holding something new. Not emptiness, curiosity. Would you like to try? Elizabeth asked gently, not stopping. Amelia didn't answer with words, but she stood, approached slowly, as if hypnotized by the sound. She stopped beside the pianoforte, her small fingers hovering above the keys like butterfly wings preparing to land. Press this one, Elizabeth said, indicating middle C. It's the simplest. The tiny hand descended. A finger touched the key. A single pure sound filled the air, cutting through years of silence. And then something extraordinary happened. The corner of Amelia's mouth, barely a millimeter, lifted upward. It wasn't a smile, not even half a smile. But it was something. For the first time in 2 years, light appeared in those empty eyes. Elizabeth felt tears stinging. Good girl, she whispered, voice thick with emotion. Just like that, once more. Amelia pressed the key again, then another. The sounds were chaotic, without melody, but to Elizabeth they rang like a symphony. The child was communicating. For the first time in 2 years, she was trying to connect with the world beyond her silence. They didn't hear the door open. "What is happening here?" The Duke's voice was low, sharp as a blade cutting silk. Both jumped. Elizabeth turned quickly. He stood in the doorway, still in riding clothes, boots muddy, hair windblown, smelling of leather and outdoors. But it wasn't his appearance that caught her attention. It was his face. He was pale as chalk, jaw clenched so tightly muscles pulsed, but his eyes, those cold steel eyes, burned with pain, anger, something she couldn't name but felt like a storm barely contained. "Your Grace," Elizabeth began, standing quickly, "I was teaching Amelia." "Music." He cut her off sharply, the word leaving his mouth like an accusation. His gaze moved to the pianoforte, then to Amelia. The child immediately cowered, hiding behind Elizabeth's skirts. "No one has played that instrument since—" He stopped. His hand clenched into a fist at his side. A vein throbbed dangerously in his neck. The smell of brandy on his breath suggested he'd been drinking, unusual for this early hour. "Since my wife died," he finished roughly. The words dragged from somewhere deep and painful. The air thickened. The scent of leather and smoke from his clothes filled the space. Elizabeth felt her own heart pounding against her ribs. "I apologize, Your Grace. I didn't know it was forbidden." His voice was quiet now, but something dangerous lived beneath the surface. "Most things in this house are forbidden, Miss Grey. I thought that was abundantly clear." He should have left. Should have ordered her never to touch the pianoforte again, and stormed out. But he didn't move. He stood frozen in the doorway, his gaze fixed on Amelia with an intensity that was almost painful to witness. The girl peeked timidly from behind Elizabeth, and then something passed across the Duke's face, pain so intense Elizabeth physically felt it in her chest, as if his agony had reached across the space and grabbed her heart. She smiled, he whispered, voice breaking on the second word. "For the first time since—" He didn't finish. Couldn't. But the step he took toward them was unconscious. As if his body moved without his mind's permission, he stopped a meter away. So close, Elizabeth could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could see the tremor in his hands he tried to hide. "Amelia," he said, and his voice was different, softer, low and breaking like ice cracking on a frozen lake. "Little one." The child extended her hand, not toward him, toward the pianoforte. She pointed at the key she'd pressed earlier, as if asking permission to continue. The Duke looked at Elizabeth. For the first time he truly looked at her, not through her, not at the walls behind her, directly into her eyes, and what she saw there stopped her breath and made time slow to honey. Fear, hope, desperation, all mixed into one painful, raw stream of emotion that no man should have to feel alone. "Please," he whispered. A single word. But it contained everything, a plea, a command, a prayer whispered by a man who'd forgotten how to pray. Elizabeth understood without explanation. She sat at the pianoforte, her hands slightly trembling. Amelia immediately slipped onto her lap, small body warm and trusting. The Duke stood motionless, as if any movement might shatter this fragile, impossible moment. She began playing the lullaby, the same one from the first day. Amelia's fingers touched her hand, trying to mimic the movements. The melody filled the room, gentle and warm as candlelight, breaking through darkness. She didn't know when he moved closer, but suddenly she felt his presence right behind her. The scent of fresh air and something deeply masculine, oak and leather and something indefinable that was purely him. She heard his breathing, uneven, controlled with visible difficulty. "She played this melody," he whispered, voice so quiet she barely heard. Not to Elizabeth, to himself, to the ghost that haunted him. Every evening before bed, Amelia would fall asleep to the sound, Catherine would sing. Elizabeth felt her own voice trembling as she answered, "It's a beautiful melody." It was her favorite. The words were barely audible, choked. Music flowed between them like a living bridge. Amelia pressed a key, this time in the right place in the melody. Elizabeth smiled through tears blurring her vision. The Duke's hand, instinctively, without thinking, descended onto her shoulder. The touch was light but intimate. The warmth of his palm penetrated through the thin cotton of her dress, burning like a brand. And then time stopped. Both realized the impropriety at the same moment. She told herself, "I should pull away. This is wrong." But her body refused to obey. His hand remained there, 1 second, 2, 3, longer than any accidental courtesy required, longer than propriety allowed, long enough for everything to change. The air became thick as honey. The melody continued, but everything else disappeared. There was only his hand on her shoulder, only the heat burning through fabric, only the awareness that he stood so close she felt each breath, each heartbeat, each tremor of emotion he couldn't control. Then Amelia turned her head. She looked at her uncle with those huge eyes, and down her cheek rolled a single perfect tear. The Duke pulled back his hand as if burned by fire. "I'm sorry," he forced out, voice strangled. He turned sharply, but before he reached the door, his voice, breaking, raw, stripped of all pretense, said, "Continue, please, she needs this." The door closed with a soft click, but Elizabeth heard, first heavy footsteps retreating down the corridor, then stopping. And then, just beyond the door, thinking no one could hear, a sound that shattered her heart into pieces. A man who hadn't cried in 3 years was crying now. Quietly, desperately, the sound of a soul finally breaking under weight it could no longer carry alone. But she heard, and something shifted in Elizabeth's chest, something dangerous and wonderful and terrifying all at once. That night Elizabeth couldn't sleep. She lay in her small room on the 3rd floor, staring at the ceiling where candlelight shadows danced like restless spirits. The sound of the Duke's weeping echoed in her head, that raw, broken sound that had torn through years of iron control like paper. What broke this man? She thought feverishly, turning onto her side. The thin mattress creaked beneath her. And why do I feel I must fix it? I'm only a governess, nothing more. But that was a lie. Something had changed that afternoon, in the moment when his hand rested on her shoulder, in the seconds when the air thickened between them like honey, in the way he'd looked at her, as if he truly saw her, not just as an employee, but as something more, something he didn't dare name. "Hey, this is dangerous," she told herself aloud, her voice barely a whisper in the darkness. "He's a duke. I'm nobody. This can only end one way, with my broken heart and ruined reputation." But logic couldn't stop her heart from racing when she remembered the warmth of his palm through her dress. At 3 a.m, unable to bear the sleeplessness any longer, she went downstairs for water. Blackwood Manor's corridors were even more terrifying at night. Her candlelight threw long, grotesque shadows that seemed to have lives of their own. Cold penetrated through her thin nightgown, raising goosebumps on her arms. As she passed the Duke's study, she saw light beneath the door. She stopped, holding her breath. Should someone be there at this ungodly hour? Voices came from within, muffled but clear enough to make out words. "Your Grace must stop torturing himself." That was Harrison, the faithful butler. His voice held the weariness of someone who'd had this conversation many times before. "It's been 3 years. 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days. The Duke's voice was flat, dead, a man reciting his own death sentence. "Exactly that long since I killed my wife." Elizabeth pressed her hand to her mouth, stifling a gasp. "Killed? What did he mean?" "Your Grace killed no one," Harrison responded firmly, with the only authority a lifelong servant could muster. "Lady Catherine died in childbirth. It was misfortune, tragedy, not murder." The sound of a glass striking wood, hard, then heavy footsteps pacing. "I shouldn't have insisted on that child." The Duke's voice trembled, the first crack in his armor. "The doctors warned her heart was weak, but I wanted an heir. I wanted continuation of the Blackwood line, and she—" His voice broke completely. "She died screaming my name, screaming for me to help her, and I couldn't do anything. I stood there like a useless coward and watched her die." Silence was thick, suffocating. Elizabeth felt tears streaming down her cheeks, hot against her cold skin. "Did the child also die?" Harrison asked quietly, voice heavy with old grief. "Yes. A son. He lived 4 hours, 4 precious hours. Catherine never even held him. Amelia was there, heard everything, the screams, the crying, the silence that followed. She was 4 years old, and from that day she hasn't spoken a word, as if watching her aunt die killed something inside her too." Elizabeth felt the picture becoming clear, horrifyingly, devastatingly clear. A little girl watching her aunt's death, hearing the agony, witnessing her uncle's despair. How could a child recover from something like that? "But today," Harrison continued, a note of hope creeping into his voice like the first bird of spring. "Today Miss Gray made Amelia smile. For the first time since that terrible day, I know. the Duke cut in sharply. And that's precisely what terrifies me, Harrison. What if I lose someone again? What if I allow myself to feel something, and then all that remains is pain? I can't survive that again. But your Grace already feels. I've seen how you look at Miss Grey, like a man waking from a long sleep. Elizabeth's heart froze. She should leave, run back to her room, but her feet were rooted to the floor. It's impossible. The Duke's whisper was barely audible through the door. She is bright, full of life, like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. And I'm a ruin. Everything I touch withers and dies. I won't let her suffer because of me. I won't let the curse of the Blackwoods claim another innocent. What if Miss Grey has something to say about that? What if she won't have a choice? The Duke's voice hardened with terrible finality. As soon as Amelia recovers enough to speak, I'll send Miss Grey back to London, with excellent references and a bonus sufficient to ensure her family's comfort for years. That's the only way to protect her. From this house, from me, from the fate that befalls anyone foolish enough to love a Blackwood. Elizabeth stepped back, her back hitting the wall. The candle nearly fell from her trembling hand, hot wax dripping onto her fingers. She barely felt the burn. He'll send me away, she thought, panic and heartbreak mixing into something unbearable. Once I finish work with Amelia, she should have felt relief. After all, she could return to her family with money and a good reference. She could start fresh, find another position, live safely. But instead of relief, she felt emptiness. Sharp, cold emptiness in the place where something had begun to sprout, something fragile and precious that had no right to exist. Attachment to the little girl who needed her, to the dark house that was slowly becoming home, to the man who hid such a deep wound she feared it might never heal. This is foolish, she whispered to herself, returning to her room on unsteady legs. You can't fall in love with someone who doesn't want to be loved. This isn't a fairy tale where love conquers all. But when she closed her eyes, she saw his face, the moment when he touched her shoulder, the way he looked at Amelia with tenderness mixed with unbearable pain, the sound of his crying behind the closed door, and she knew, with terrible certainty, it was already too late. Her heart had made its choice, regardless of what logic demanded. In the morning at breakfast, Harrison approached her quietly. Miss Grey, may I have a word? He led her to the library, the first warm, welcoming space she'd found in Blackwood Manor. Sunlight poured through tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The scent of old books and leather filled her senses. I know you heard last night, he said without preamble, his aged eyes kind but knowing. She blushed crimson. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. I don't blame you. These walls are thin as wedding veils. He sat heavily, suddenly looking every bit his 70 years. I've worked for the Blackwood family for 40 years. I saw His Grace as a child, a young man, a husband, and I never saw him as happy as he was with Lady Catherine. He paused, moving his gaze to a portrait hanging above the fireplace. A young woman in a light dress holding roses. Her smile was pure, innocent, full of life that had been extinguished far too soon. When she died, something in him broke, shattered beyond recognition. He blamed himself. He shut the west wing, their bedroom, the nursery for the son who never lived to see his first birthday. He got rid of everything that reminded him of happiness, except that pianoforte. He wouldn't let anyone touch it, but wouldn't let it be thrown away either, like keeping one last piece of her alive. Why are you telling me this? Elizabeth asked quietly, though she thought she knew. Harrison looked directly into her eyes. Because for the first time in 3 years, I see a spark of life in his eyes. And it's because of you. Amelia is beginning to return to the world, and he's beginning to feel again, even if he fights it with everything in him. But he said he'll send me away once. I know what he said. But believe me, Miss Grey, a man who feels nothing doesn't plan elaborate protections for a woman. He's terrified, not that he feels nothing, that he feels too much, too fast, too dangerously. The words hung between them like spider silk, beautiful but fragile. Elizabeth felt something warm spreading in her chest, hope, dangerous, fragile hope that could destroy her if she wasn't careful. What should I do? She whispered, voicing the question that had haunted her all night. Stay. Continue healing Amelia, and let His Grace see that life, hope, love, they're not curses, they're gifts, even if those gifts come wrapped in fear and risk. Harrison stood, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let ourselves be loved, even when it terrifies us. The following 2 weeks brought subtle changes that built like waves, invisible at first, but gradually gaining strength that even the servants noticed. Amelia began not only listening to music but attempting to play. Her fingers, initially uncertain, slowly found the right keys. She still didn't speak, but communicated differently, pointing at notes in books, nodding her head, and sometimes, very rarely, her lips formed something that might be the ghost of a smile. Elizabeth felt a strange pride with each small victory. "See," she'd say softly to the girl, tucking a dark curl behind her ear. "Music can speak when words aren't ready. And when you're ready, the words will come too." But what happened between her and the Duke was far more complicated. A dance neither knew the steps to. It started with small things. They'd pass in corridors. He always nodded stiffly, never stopping. But his gaze lingered on her face a second longer than courtesy required. Once she found a new collection of sheet music on the nursery table, Mozart's works, her favorite composer. The pages were pristine, expensive, clearly purchased specifically for her. Harrison denied bringing them. "Perhaps His Grace," he said evasively, a knowing twinkle in his aged eyes as he turned away. On the 5th day of the 2nd week, something happened that made Elizabeth's heart skip dangerously. She was teaching Amelia a simple scale when there was a knock. The Duke stood in the doorway, looking profoundly uncomfortable. He held a small wrapped package. "I brought you these," he said awkwardly, extending the package like a schoolboy caught stealing apples. His ears were slightly pink. "For your educational purposes, with the child." Elizabeth took the package, her fingers brushing his for the briefest moment. Electricity shot up her arm. She unwrapped it to find exquisite hair ribbons for Amelia, silk in every color imaginable. "Your Grace, this is too generous?" "It's nothing." He cleared his throat, looked at the wall behind her, then at the floor, anywhere but at her eyes. A child should have ribbons and such. For a man who commanded estates and armies, who made grown men tremble with a glance, he was spectacularly terrible at this. Elizabeth bit her lip to stop from smiling. "Thank you," she said gently. "Amelia will love them." He nodded once, sharply, and practically fled the room. Through the open door she heard him mutter something that sounded like, "And such? What am I, a village idiot?" She did smile then. Behind his icy exterior lived a man who'd forgotten how to be human, and it was endearing in a way that terrified her. 2 days later came the library incident. It was late, around 10 in the evening. Amelia had been asleep for an hour. Elizabeth went to the library, unable to sleep, drawn by the promise of books and firelight. She took Byron's poetry and settled by the hearth. "She walks in beauty like the night," she read in a whisper, savoring each word. "Of cloudless climes and starry skies," a deep voice finished behind her. She jumped, the book tumbling from her hands. The Duke stood in the doorway, still in formal dress but his cravat loosened, the first 2 buttons of his shirt undone in a way that seemed almost scandalous. He held a brandy glass that caught firelight in an amber glow. "I apologize," he said, entering. "I didn't mean to startle you. I thought everyone was asleep." "I couldn't sleep," she managed, acutely aware she was in her dressing gown, hair loose on her shoulders. Improper, very improper. "I should go." "Please stay." His voice was quiet, but something in it, a plea, loneliness, stopped her in place. "I rarely have occasion to speak with someone who reads Byron at this hour, who understands poetry as more than pretty words." He sat in the chair opposite, maintaining proper distance. But the air between them suddenly became charged. The scent of his cologne, sandalwood with a note of tobacco, reached her, mixing with wood smoke and leather from the bound books surrounding them. "I enjoy his poetry," she said quietly, retrieving the book from the floor. "There's passion in it, but also profound sadness, as if he understood both joy and sorrow too deeply. Byron was a master at combining both." He sipped his brandy, his eyes never leaving her face. The intensity of his gaze made her skin warm. "Do you know why the greatest poems about love are written by people who've suffered? Because pain teaches us the value of happiness?" The words came before she could stop them. Something crossed his face, surprise, recognition, something that looked almost like relief. Exactly. A man who's never lost anything precious doesn't appreciate what he has. He takes it for granted until it's gone." Silence stretched between them, heavy with meaning. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the house a clock chimed the half-hour. "Amelia is making remarkable progress," the Duke said suddenly, as if trying to return to safer ground. "Thanks to you." "She's stronger than anyone realizes," Elizabeth responded carefully. "She just needed a safe way to express what she feels. Music became her voice when words were too painful." And you?" He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. So close now she could see flecks of silver in his dark hair, the shadow of stubble on his jaw. "Do you have a safe way to express what you feel?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Her heart beat so loudly she was certain he could hear it. "I try to be strong. For my family. For Amelia. For—" She stopped, not daring to finish. "But who is strong for you?" The words struck something deep in her chest. No one had ever asked her that. Everyone assumed she could carry the burden alone, that she didn't need support because she was so capable of giving it. Tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them. She turned her head sharply, trying to hide weakness. But she heard him stand. Footsteps on the carpet, the warmth of his presence as he stood beside her chair. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice so filled with pain it hurt her heart. "I had no right to ask that question. No one," she interrupted, still not looking at him. "No one is strong for me. And that's all right. I've learned to be enough by myself." Long silence. Then she felt something, warm fabric on her shoulders, his jacket. He was wrapping her in it, his fingers brushing her bare shoulder through the thin dressing gown. The touch lasted a fraction of a second, but burned into her skin like a brand. "No one should be alone," he said quietly, stepping back quickly as if the contact had shocked him too. "Even if they convince themselves it's enough." She turned then, looking up at him. Firelight danced on his face, casting shadows that emphasized every line of exhaustion, pain, loneliness. His eyes, those cold steel eyes, burned now with something that made her forget how to breathe. "Your Grace," she began. "Alexander," he cut in roughly. "When we're alone, please, call me Alexander." Using his first name was an intimacy reserved for family, close friends, not for a governess and her employer, but the way he spoke it, almost like a plea, made refusal impossible. "Alexander," she whispered, tasting the name on her tongue. It felt dangerous, forbidden, perfect. His jaw clenched, the fist at his side trembled. We shouldn't. He fought with words that refused to come. "This is dangerous territory." "What is?" "This," he gestured between them helplessly. "This closeness. I feel the walls I've built for 3 years crumbling, and when they fall completely—" He didn't finish, didn't need to. She saw it in his eyes, fear of feeling something again, fear of loss, fear of being alive when for so long he'd been merely existing. She stood slowly, his jacket slipping from her shoulders. They stood inches apart. Neither moved, neither breathed. The world narrowed to this moment, this space, this impossible connection. "Perhaps," she said quietly, voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "Walls don't protect us. Perhaps they only imprison." His breathing was uneven. His hand lifted. For a long, agonizing second it hung in the air between them, fingers almost touching her cheek. Almost. Then he dropped his hand. "Good night, Miss Grey." He turned and left, leaving her alone with a racing heart and the certainty that something fundamental had just shifted between them, something irreversible that would change everything. The next morning everything changed. Elizabeth woke with the feeling that the world had shifted on its axis. The memory of his voice, Alexander, echoed in her head, the way his fingers had hovered near her face, as if touching might change everything, or destroy everything. "What was I thinking?" she whispered to her reflection, braiding her hair into a severe bun. "He's a duke. I'm a governess. This story can only end one way, in heartbreak." But her heart wouldn't listen to logic. It raced at the thought of seeing him again. Amelia was unusually animated that morning. For the first time, she approached the pianoforte herself, not waiting for encouragement. Her small fingers played a simple melody, 5 notes Elizabeth had taught her yesterday. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Enormous, beautiful progress. "Wonderful!" Elizabeth exclaimed, crouching beside the girl. "Will you play it again?" Amelia nodded enthusiastically. And then, something extraordinary happened. Her mouth opened. No sound emerged, but Elizabeth saw the girl was trying. For the first time in 2 years, she was trying to speak. "Don't rush," she said gently, taking the small hand in hers. Words will come when you're ready. There's no hurry, darling. But deep inside she felt excitement crackling like lightning. This was a breakthrough. Harrison had been right. Amelia was returning. Slowly, like spring melting winter's ice, but returning. The sound of carriages on the drive interrupted the moment. Voices drifted from below, refined, loud, decidedly feminine, and carrying the sharp edge of entitlement. Harrison appeared in the doorway, his face unusually tense. "Miss Grey, His Grace requests your presence in the drawing room, immediately." Something in his tone triggered alarm bells. "What's happened?" "Guests," he said shortly, the single word heavy with warning. "Lady Victoria Hertford and her mother, the Countess of Ashby. They've arrived for a visit." The name meant nothing to her, but the way Harrison said Lady Victoria, with barely concealed distaste, spoke volumes. She left Amelia in a maid's care and descended, smoothing her plain brown dress. Compared to Blackwood Manor's luxury, she looked like a servant, which, she reminded herself, was exactly what she was. The drawing room was the most elegant space in the house, rarely used, filled with priceless antiques and velvet furniture that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Afternoon light poured through tall windows, reflecting off crystal vases. But it wasn't the interior that caught her attention. It was the woman standing beside the Duke. Lady Victoria Hertford was devastatingly, impossibly beautiful. Perhaps 26, tall, with a figure perfectly wrapped in a blue silk gown that must have cost more than Elizabeth's entire year's salary. Platinum hair arranged in an intricate coiffure that probably required 2 maids. Emerald eyes that assessed every detail of the room and every person with calculating precision. "Oh, Alexander," her voice was like honey, sweet but with something hard and sharp underneath. "You didn't mention you'd hired new staff. How quaint." Victoria's perfume announced her presence like a trumpet blast. Roses and something else, something cloying and overwhelming. Elizabeth noticed Amelia, who'd followed downstairs out of curiosity, actually backed up 3 steps when the scent hit her, little nose wrinkling in distaste. Elizabeth bit her lip hard to stop from laughing at the child's honest reaction. "I'm governess to Lady Amelia, your ladyship," Elizabeth managed, feeling heat creeping up her cheeks. "A governess!" Victoria laughed, the sound like bells but completely false. "Of course. Forgive me, dear, that dress is so utilitarian, I assumed you were a housemaid. Easy mistake." "Lady Victoria!" The Duke's voice was cold as January ice cutting through steel. "Miss Grey is a highly qualified educator. I ask for respect in my home." Something flashed in Victoria's eyes, fury, quickly hidden beneath a mask of perfect charm. "Of course, Your Grace. I meant no offense to the help." The help! The words stung like a slap, which was precisely their intent. Victoria's mother, an older woman with sharp features and diamonds the size of quail eggs around her neck, assessed Elizabeth with a look as if she were an insect pinned to a board. "Alexander, dear boy, your friendship with our family goes back 3 generations. Victoria and you were always so close as children." "That was long ago," the Duke responded stiffly, his jaw tight. "But perhaps it's time to renew old bonds?" The Countess smiled, showing teeth too white and perfect. "Victoria is a widow now. Lord Hertford, God rest his soul, left her with a considerable fortune but no children. It would be an advantageous match for both families." Elizabeth felt as if someone had punched her stomach, driving all air from her lungs. So that was it. Victoria hadn't come for a social visit. She'd come hunting. And the prey was Alexander. "Mother is absolutely right." Victoria moved closer to the Duke, her hand lightly touching his arm, a gesture intimate, possessive, practiced. "You've been alone far too long, darling. You need a wife, someone of appropriate status, who understands your duties and responsibilities, someone who—" Her gaze slid to Elizabeth, and in it was something cold and calculating, a warning shot across the bow. "Who won't forget their place in the natural order." The air thickened with tension. The Duke freed his arm from her grasp with barely concealed irritation. "Please excuse me, but I have a state business to attend to. Harrison will show you to the guest rooms." "We're staying?" Elizabeth couldn't stop the words that burst from her lips, horror clear in her voice. Victoria turned, triumph flashing in her emerald eyes like a cat that had cornered a mouse. "Of course, my dear girl. The Countess and I will remain a week, at minimum. Alexander and I have so much to catch up on." She smiled, all teeth and no warmth. "I do hope we won't be in your way, though I suppose governesses hardly notice such things, tucked away in nurseries as they are." For the next 3 days, Elizabeth experienced what true humiliation felt like. Victoria was a master of subtle degradation, each insult wrapped in silk, each cruelty disguised as concern. At breakfast, she'd comment on Elizabeth's dress. "How wonderfully practical that you wear the same garments daily. Thrift is such a noble virtue for those who must practice it." At dinner, she ignored her presence entirely, conversing only with Alexander about people Elizabeth didn't know, places she'd never been, a world she'd never enter. But worst were the moments when Victoria demonstrated her intimacy with Alexander. Childhood memories delivered with possessive smiles, family stories that excluded everyone else, subtle touches of arm or hand, all proper, all appropriate, but all designed to mark territory like a cat rubbing against furniture. "He'll never be yours," each gesture said. "You don't deserve him." On the 4th evening, Elizabeth sat in the nursery helping Amelia prepare for bed. The girl had been restless since the guests arrived. Victoria had attempted to bond the second day, but her false tone and that suffocating perfume frightened the child. Amelia had actually hidden behind Elizabeth's skirts, refusing to emerge until Victoria left. A knock on the door. Harrison entered, his face grave as a funeral. "Miss Gray, His Grace requests your presence in his study, privately." Her heart stopped. Since the library night, they'd avoided being alone, as if both understood another moment like that might push them past a boundary that couldn't be uncrossed. The study was drowning in semi-darkness, only the desk lamp casting pools of golden light. Alexander stood by the window, back to her, shoulders rigid with tension. The air held the sharp scent of brandy. "Close the door," he said quietly, voice tight. She did, her hands trembling. "Your Grace wished to—" "I must warn you." He turned sharply, his face pale, jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping. "Lady Victoria, her intentions aren't pure." "I know," she whispered. "She wants to become Duchess." "Worse." He moved toward her, each step deliberate. "I discovered today. She's been seeking compromising information about you." The world tilted sickeningly. "What?" "She sent a servant to London to track your family. He learned about your father's gambling debts, that your sister had no debut, that you live in—" He stopped, as if the words caused physical pain. "In Whitechapel, one of the worst slums." Tears flooded her eyes before she could stop them. Shame burned hotter than any physical wound, scorching through her chest. "Does she intend to reveal this?" Her voice barely worked. "She intends to use it as proof that you're unsuitable, that you threaten this house's reputation, that—" He moved closer, so close she could see the anguish in his eyes, "that employing someone of your background reflects poorly on me." "She doesn't need to prove what's obvious," Elizabeth said bitterly. "I'm not good enough for this world. We both know it." That's not true." His voice was raw, full of barely controlled fury. Not at her, at the world that judged her. "Your worth doesn't depend on money or title or which street you were born on. For them it does, for Victoria, for your entire society." They stood less than a meter apart. Tension vibrated between them like a living thing, crackling in the air. "If you want me to leave," she began, each word cutting like glass. "No!" The word exploded from him like a gunshot. "I don't want you to leave. I want—" He stopped, breathing hard. "God help me, I want things I have no right to want." In that moment, the door opened without knocking. Victoria stood in the threshold, her face a perfect mask of triumph mixed with false shock. "Ah," she said sweetly, voice dripping poison. What an intimate scene. A governess alone with a duke, in a closed study, after dark. Her smile was a dagger aimed straight at Elizabeth's heart. I wonder what society would say about this, what the scandal sheets would print, what every respectable family in England would think. The trap snapped shut with the finality of a coffin lid closing. Time froze. Victoria stood in the doorway like a beautiful serpent, but her eyes blazed with the triumph of a predator who just caught her prey in an inescapable snare. The scent of her perfume, roses and something cloying, filled the room like smoke. Elizabeth felt the ground disappearing beneath her feet. "This isn't what you think," she managed, though her voice trembled. "Really?" Victoria glided into the room, closing the door behind her with a soft click that sounded like a judge's gavel. "So what exactly is it?" A governess alone with her employer after dark, doors closed. Please enlighten me how society should interpret this situation. Lady Victoria, the Duke's voice was ice-cutting steel. We were discussing Lady Amelia's progress, nothing more. Oh, I'm absolutely certain you were. Victoria's smile could have cut glass. But does that matter? The facts are, I found you alone, in improper circumstances. And facts, Alexander, have a rather nasty way of living their own lives once they reach the right ears, or the wrong ones, depending on one's perspective. Elizabeth understood with sickening clarity. This was planned from the start. Victoria had deliberately come at this hour, deliberately opened the door without knocking. This was an ambush, carefully orchestrated. What do you want? Alexander asked, voice dangerously quiet. Victoria turned to him, adopting an expression of false concern so perfect it could have fooled angels. I only want to protect your reputation, dear friend. And this poor girl's reputation too, of course. Her gaze slid to Elizabeth, and in it was something cold and merciless. Imagine the scandal. The Duke of Blackwood seduces an innocent, desperate governess, exploits her poverty. When this story reaches London, and make no mistake, it will, her name will be destroyed. No family will hire her. No respectable house will allow her through their doors. Her younger sister's marriage prospects will evaporate like morning dew. Elizabeth thought of Caroline, sweet, innocent Caroline who dreamed of a good marriage, a happy life. This scandal would destroy those dreams forever. Her hands shook so badly, she clasped them behind her back so Victoria wouldn't see the weakness. But, Victoria continued, voice now like honey dripping from a poisoned knife, I'm a reasonable woman. I understand mistakes happen. That loneliness can lead to regrettable choices. She moved closer to Alexander, her hand touching his arm with practiced intimacy. I could forget what I saw, under one simple condition. What condition? Alexander's jaw was so tight Elizabeth feared his teeth might crack. Send her away, tomorrow, back to London. Give her whatever references and money you promised, but she must leave Blackwood Manor. And you, Victoria looked up at him, her eyes gleaming with something that might be desire or hunger or pure ambition. You will seriously consider my proposal. I'm a widow of appropriate rank. You're a widower. Our families have been allied for 3 generations. It would be the most natural thing in the world. Silence was thick, suffocating. Elizabeth waited for his response, each second stretching like hours of torture. Leave me, he said finally, voice empty as a tomb. Both of you, I must think. Victoria smiled triumphantly. Of course, darling. Take all night if you need. But remember, by noon tomorrow I require a decision, or this unfortunate situation becomes very public indeed. She swept out, leaving behind the cloying scent of roses and victory. Elizabeth stood frozen, feeling her world crumbling. So this is the end, she whispered. I should have known better than to hope. Don't. His voice was raw, stripped of all armor. He crossed to her in 3 strides. His hands grasped her shoulders, not gently, but desperately, like a drowning man clutching driftwood. This isn't the end. I won't let her win, but she's right. Tears flowed freely now. If I stay, I'll destroy your reputation, Amelia's future, my own family. I must leave. What if I don't want you to leave? His face was inches from hers, so close she could see every shadow of pain in his eyes. What if over these weeks I've begun to feel something I shouldn't, something that terrifies me more than any threat of scandal ever could? Breath caught in her throat. Alexander, for 3 years I was dead, Elizabeth, walking, talking, but inside, empty as a crypt, until you came, with your music and your kindness and your light, and suddenly I could breathe again, feel again, live again. His thumb wiped a tear from her cheek, the touch so tender it hurt. I can't lose you. Not now when I've just found myself again. Everything in her screamed to lean into him, to let this moment transform into something more. But reason, cold, brutal reason, held her back. But what are we if we can't be together? She whispered through tears. You're a duke. I'm nobody. Even if... She couldn't finish. Even if you love me. Even if I love you. His hands dropped as if the words had drained all strength from him. He turned away, bracing against the desk, head bowed in defeat. You're right, he said finally, voice flat and dead, the same tone from their first meeting. I was a fool to think otherwise, that the past doesn't matter, that society would forgive us. A deep, shuddering breath. I'll prepare the carriage. Tomorrow you return to London, with £1,000 in references ensuring you a position in any house in England. £1,000, a fortune, enough to secure her family for years, enough for Caroline to have her debut, enough to never worry about survival again. But the price, leaving him, leaving Amelia, leaving the place that had become home, was unbearable. And Amelia? Her voice broke on the name. She's just beginning to heal. If I leave now, I'll find someone else, someone better, someone who won't complicate everything so impossibly. He still didn't look at her. Couldn't. If he did, they both knew control would shatter. Elizabeth nodded, though he didn't see. I understand. I'll pack my things. She moved toward the door on legs that barely functioned, hand on the doorknob. One turn and everything would end. Elizabeth. She stopped, not turning, not breathing. If the world were different, his voice was so quiet she barely heard it. If titles didn't matter, if I could choose anything, anyone. He paused, the words costing him everything. It would be you. It would always be you. The words drove into her heart like a dagger, beautiful, painful, deadly. She didn't answer. Couldn't. She simply opened the door and left, leaving behind the man who loved her enough to let her go. When she reached her room and the door closed, she allowed herself one moment of weakness. She collapsed on the bed and wept, deep body-shaking sobs that no one heard. Victoria had won, and Elizabeth had lost everything that mattered. But what she didn't know, as exhaustion finally claimed her, was that downstairs, Alexander stood alone in his study, Victoria's letter in his hands. The letter she'd written to destroy Elizabeth's reputation, the letter she planned to send to every family in London. And for the first time in 3 years, Alexander Blackwood wasn't drowning in grief. He was burning with rage. Dawn came too quickly. Elizabeth hadn't slept. She'd only lain with burning eyes, staring at the ceiling where first light painted patterns that reminded her of everything she was losing. The room that had become sanctuary, the house that had become home, and the man whose words still echoed. It would always be you. But it's not enough, she whispered to the empty room. Love without possibility is just beautiful torture. At 6, she began packing. She had so little. 3 dresses, a pair of shoes, a few books. Everything fit in one small case. Looking at it, she thought bitterly. My entire world in one bag, as if I was never here at all. A knock. Harrison entered with a tray, tea, toast, jam. But his eyes were red, swollen. He'd been crying. Miss Gray, he began, voice thick. His Grace instructed me to give you a check for £1,000 and this letter of recommendation. He pulled out an envelope, but his hand shook. But I must tell you, this is wrong. Your presence here changed everything. Amelia laughs now. His Grace lives again, and now I must leave before I destroy it all, she finished quietly. She took the envelope. The weight was all wrong, not the weight of paper and money, the weight of goodbye. At 8, Harrison informed her the carriage would be ready at 10. 2 hours, 120 minutes to say goodbye to Amelia. The child sat by her window, but when Elizabeth entered, Amelia turned immediately, and in her eyes was understanding, as if she sensed the ending approaching. Amelia, Elizabeth began, kneeling beside her. She took the small hands. I must tell you something difficult. The child's eyes widened, her mouth trembled, that movement Elizabeth had learned to recognize. Amelia was trying to speak, trying to say no. I must return to London, Elizabeth continued, voice breaking. To my family. But that doesn't mean I forget you. I'll never forget you. Tears she'd been holding back spilled over. You're the bravest girl I know. And soon you'll speak again. I know it. Amelia yanked her hands away, her face contorted, anger, pain, betrayal, all mixed into anguish. She ran to the pianoforte and began striking keys, not melody, chaos, a scream expressed through music, because words still wouldn't come. Elizabeth approached, embraced her from behind. I know, she whispered. I know it hurts. It hurts me too. The small body trembled. Then, suddenly, Amelia turned and hugged her fiercely. The first true embrace. And Elizabeth let tears flow freely. The bell downstairs chimed. 10 o'clock, the carriage waiting. I must go, Elizabeth whispered, kissing Amelia's head. The scent of lavender soap So familiar, so precious. But I promise, I'll think of you every day. She stood, forcing herself to move. Amelia stood motionless, watching, and then the girl's mouth opened. Air filled her throat. A sound, thin, broken, but clear, emerged. "Don't go!" The first words in 2 years. Elizabeth froze completely. Turning would shatter her, but she couldn't not respond. "You spoke," she whispered through tears. "Darling, you spoke. That means you'll be all right. You'll be all right." She ran before Amelia could say more. Downstairs that blurred, to the entrance hall where her case waited. Harrison stood by the door. He said nothing, just nodded. The compassion in his eyes was unbearable. The carriage stood in the drive. The footman took her case. Everything happened in fog. "Miss Grey." Alexander's voice. She turned. He stood at the stairs top, still in last night's clothes, hair disheveled, face pale as death. He looked like he'd walked through hell and back. He began, stopped. What could be said? Their eyes met, and she saw everything she felt reflected back. Pain, regret, love they couldn't express. "Be happy," she said finally, barely audible. "That's all I wish for." She entered the carriage. The door closed with finality. The driver cracked his whip. Wheels turned. As they pulled away, she looked through the window. Alexander still stood on those steps, motionless as a monument. Even from distance she could see. Something in his posture spoke of despair so deep it had no bottom. Blackwood Manor disappeared into morning mist. But what Elizabeth didn't know, as her carriage vanished down the road, was that 10 minutes after she left, Harrison found something, a copy of Victoria's letter. The maid had discovered it on Victoria's desk and brought it immediately to the butler. Alexander read it, the words burned, "To the esteemed members of London society. It is with heavy heart I inform you of scandalous behavior observed at Blackwood Manor. Miss Elizabeth Grey, purported governess, was found in compromising circumstances with His Grace." His hands trembled, not with grief, with rage. "She lied," he whispered. "Everything was manipulation, and I let Elizabeth leave thinking it would protect her. But this letter would destroy her worse than any scandal." "Your Grace?" Harrison said quietly. "The carriage left 10 minutes ago. On these muddy roads in this weather, it will move slowly." Alexander was already moving. "Prepare, Tempest, the fastest horse, now." "In this rain, Your Grace?" "I don't care about the rain." His voice was steel. "I don't care about scandal or society or anything except getting her back." 3 minutes later, he sat on the black stallion. The sky was gray, threatening storm. "Ride," he whispered to Tempest. "Ride like life depends on it." Because it did. The gallop through muddy roads was mad, dangerous. Rain began falling, first gentle, then torrential. Tempest slipped twice but held. Each hoofbeat measured time. Each minute meant she was farther away. And then, on the horizon, he saw it, the carriage, moving slowly, wheels sinking in mud. "Stop!" he shouted. "Stop!" He caught them in 5 minutes, blocked the road. The driver pulled reins with terror. "Your Grace, what—" "Open the door." Alexander was already dismounting, mud splashing. "Now." The door opened, and there she sat, Elizabeth, her face pale, eyes wide with shock. "Alexander," she whispered, "what are you—" He climbed into the carriage, closing the door. The space was small, intimate. Her lavender scent mixed with rain and leather. "Victoria lied," he said without preamble. "She wrote a letter to destroy your reputation even after you left. She planned to ruin you regardless." Color drained from her face. "What?" "But I won't let her." He grasped her hands, his palms cold and wet but grip desperate. "I won't let anyone hurt you. Not Victoria, not society, not the damned world that says I can't love who I choose." The word hung, love. "Alexander," her voice trembled, "you can't say such things. It doesn't change facts." "To hell with facts." His intensity burned. "For 3 years I walked in darkness. You taught me that life without risk isn't life. It's cowardice, and I'm done being a coward. Rain hammered the roof like drums. But if I return, the scandal, let them talk." His voice was final. "If society can't accept my choice, I'll leave society. I'll close myself in Blackwood Manor with you, with Amelia, with anyone who truly matters, but I won't let you leave again." She stared at him, breathing uneven. He opened the door, stepped into rain. Mud reached his ankles, water flooded his face. He dropped to one knee before the carriage, before her, before the world. "Elizabeth Grey," he said loudly, voice carried by wind. "I ask you, Not as Duke asking Governess, but as a man begging the woman he loves. Will you return? Will you marry me? Will you let me spend my life proving you're worth every risk? Elizabeth looked down at him, this powerful man kneeling in mud like a common person. Rain streamed down his face, mixing with what might be tears. His eyes blazed with an intensity that stole her breath. Yes, she whispered, voice barely audible through the storm. Yes, I'll return with you. For one suspended second, he didn't move, as if he couldn't believe what he'd heard. Then he stood, mud and water falling from his clothes, and pulled her into his arms. His embrace was strong, desperate, holding her like something precious he'd almost lost. I swear, he whispered into her hair, every day of my life I'll make you never regret this. She didn't answer with words. She simply lifted her face, and when their lips met for the first time, the world vanished. There was only rain, only cold, only the warmth of his body against hers. The kiss was desperate, full of months of restraint, weeks of walking the edge of something forbidden. When they finally pulled apart, both trembled. Not from cold, from something far more powerful. We must return, he said. Victoria, we need to face her together. The journey back was swift. Alexander rode Tempest beside the carriage, refusing to leave her even for a moment. Every few minutes he'd glance through the window, as if checking she was still there. That this wasn't a dream. When they reached Blackwood Manor, it was evening. The storm had passed, leaving everything washed clean. Lights in the windows burned warm, but tension returned as the carriage stopped. Victoria stood on the steps, her face a mask of fury. What is the meaning of this? She cried, seeing Elizabeth descending. I told her to leave. You have no authority to give orders in my house. Alexander's voice was quiet but deadly. He approached Elizabeth, took her hand publicly. A declaration. Lady Victoria, I received a copy of your letter. The one you planned to send to London. Color drained from Victoria's face, but she recovered quickly. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie. Harrison appeared in the doorway, holding the original letter. We found it in your room, along with copies addressed to 20 families. Silence was thick. Victoria opened her mouth, closed it, then her face twisted with rage. I was doing this for your own good, Alexander. This woman is nobody. She'll destroy your reputation, your lineage. She saved me, he responded calmly. When I was dead inside, she brought me back to life. And now I intend to marry her. The words dropped like a bomb. Victoria staggered as if physically struck. Marry? A governess? Have you gone completely mad? Perhaps, but for the first time in years, I feel alive. He turned to Elizabeth, a genuine smile touching his lips, the first she'd seen. Elizabeth Grey, I formally ask for your hand. Will you be my wife? She could feel everyone's eyes. Harrison full of joy, Victoria full of venom, servants gathering in shadows. But only one thing mattered, the man before her who'd risked everything. Yes, she said clearly, I will be your wife. Victoria screamed something, threats, insults, but her voice faded into background noise. The Countess of Ashby appeared, trying to calm her daughter, but the damage was done. Within an hour, Victoria's carriage vanished into the night, and Blackwood Manor settled into a peace it hadn't known in years. That night, when everything quieted, Alexander led Elizabeth to the west wing. For the first time, he opened the locked doors. The rooms were dusty but beautiful. A bedroom with enormous windows, a nursery with an empty cradle that had waited 3 years to be filled. I wanted to show you, he said quietly, the place I've been running from. But I'm not running anymore. I intend to transform these rooms, with you, for us. She touched the cradle, fingers leaving tracks in dust. And Catherine's memory will always be part of me. She taught me how to love, but you taught me how to live despite loss. That's not betrayal. That's evolution. Elizabeth nodded, understanding. The past didn't disappear, but it stopped weighing so heavily. The next morning, when sunlight poured through windows, Amelia ran to Elizabeth's room. This time she wasn't silent. You came back, she said clearly, voice thin but certain. I knew you would. Tears flooded Elizabeth's eyes. She knelt, embracing the girl. I promise I'll never leave again. Good, Amelia pulled back, her small face serious. Because Uncle needs us, both of us. And she was right. Alexander needed them, just as they needed him. 3 weeks later, in the small family chapel of Blackwood Manor, Elizabeth Grey stood before the altar in a simple white dress. There were no hundreds of guests, no splendor of a grand London wedding. Only those closest, Harrison with tears streaming down his weathered face, a few of Alexander's loyal friends, Mother and Caroline, who'd arrived from London with disbelief painted on their faces, and Amelia, who held the bouquet, her voice, still thin but growing stronger daily, singing softly the melody Elizabeth had taught her at the pianoforte. The priest spoke words, but Elizabeth heard only her own heartbeat. Alexander stood opposite, his hand holding hers with a strength that said, "I'll never let you go again." "Do you take this woman to be your wife?" "I do." His voice was strong, certain, without a shadow of doubt. "Do you take this man to be your husband?" Elizabeth looked into his eyes, those eyes that once were cold as winter ice, now burned with warmth that could melt glaciers, and answered, "I do." When their lips met, sealing the vow, applause filled the small chapel. It wasn't loud, but it was genuine. Harrison wiped his eyes openly. Caroline giggled joyfully, and Amelia, brave, small Amelia, threw herself at them both, embracing them together. "Now we're a family," she said, voice ringing like a bell. "A real family." And in that moment, Elizabeth understood. Family wasn't defined by blood or title. It was defined by love, choice, devotion. The reception was modest but full of joy. Music flowed from the pianoforte. Alexander played now, his fingers uncertain but full of determination. He'd learned for her, for Amelia, for himself. He was spectacularly terrible at it. Missed notes, wrong tempo, fingers stumbling over keys. But Elizabeth had never heard anything more beautiful. "Do you remember?" she whispered, standing beside him. "When you said everything you touch dies?" His fingers stopped on the keys. He turned, question in his eyes. "You were wrong," she continued quietly. "Everything you touch comes alive. Amelia speaks. This house has light in the windows again, and I—" She paused, joyful tears welling. "I'm truly alive for the first time in years." His hand touched her cheek, thumb wiping away a tear. "You taught me that life after loss is possible, that hearts can break and heal, that love isn't punishment for happiness, it's the reward for courage." 3 months later, news of their marriage reached London. Queen Victoria, who'd heard how Elizabeth helped Amelia regain speech, sent a congratulatory letter. "Any woman who heals a child's wounds deserves respect, regardless of birth," she wrote. "The Duchess of Blackwood has our blessing." That single letter changed everything. If the Queen approved, society had to follow. Doors began opening, not all, not immediately, but enough. Victoria, meanwhile, married an elderly widowed earl and moved to Scotland. Sometimes Elizabeth wondered if she was happy, but then decided some questions didn't deserve the energy. A year after their wedding, on a warm autumn day, Elizabeth stood by the window of their renovated bedroom in the West Wing. Her hand rested on her rounded belly, 3 months pregnant. Alexander came from behind, embraced her, his hand covering hers. "Are you afraid?" he asked quietly, thinking of Catherine. "A little," she admitted honestly, "but the doctors say I'm healthy, strong, and I have you." "Always," he vowed. 5 months later, on a bright April morning, Elizabeth gave birth to a healthy son. He cried loudly, tiny fists clenched. Alexander held him with absolute reverence. "He looks like you," he whispered through tears. "He has your strength." They named him William, after Elizabeth's father, whose mistakes taught her the value of wise choices. Amelia, now 9 and talking constantly, was delighted. "I'll teach him pianoforte," she announced, "just like you taught me." 5 years later, in that same nursery where everything began, Elizabeth sat with William and their little daughter, Rose, reading them a story. Amelia, now 14, intelligent and confident, practiced Chopin in the next room. Alexander entered, still in riding clothes. He sat beside them, eyes full of wonder. "What?" Elizabeth asked, smiling. "I'm just thinking about who I was 5 years ago. A man without hope, without future, convinced happiness was for others. And now? Now I know I was foolish." His hand found hers. "Happiness isn't a reward for pain. It's a choice we make every day, the choice to love despite risk, to live despite fear, to believe tomorrow can be better than yesterday." William, displaying his father's stubbornness and mother's determination, refused to eat his vegetables. "A dangerous combination," Harrison remarked dryly, watching the 3-year-old's rebellion. The world isn't ready for this one. Elizabeth laughed, a sound that filled the house with light. That night, when children slept, Elizabeth stood by the window where she'd once watched the West Wing with anxiety. Now it was full of life, a nursery with toys, a bedroom full of warmth. Alexander joined her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "Do you have any regrets?" he asked quietly. She considered. "No, because everything, every pain, every fear, every tear, led me here, to this house, to this family, to you." He nodded, understanding. Life's greatest gifts often came wrapped in the hardest challenges. "And you know what's best?" she added. "What?" "Somewhere out there is a girl, maybe a governess, maybe a maid, who feels invisible, who thinks her life is written, that she has no choice. And our story shows her. There's always choice. There's always hope, even in the darkest night." Alexander smiled, deep, reaching his eyes. "So our story matters." "All stories matter," she responded, "especially those reminding us it's worth fighting for love, worth being brave, worth believing life after pain isn't just possible, it's beautiful." As they stood there, in darkness brightened by stars, they were living proof. Sometimes the best stories don't begin with "once upon a time," but with "despite everything." Despite loss, despite fear, despite what the world says is possible. Their story began with mud, tears, impossible odds. But it ended, as all the best stories do, with hope, healing, and love worth every risk. The end. This story reminds us courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Love is not chance, but a choice we make every day. And our wounds, though painful, can become the source of our greatest strength if we allow them to teach us, not destroy us.